Good afternoon. This is the PowerPoint presentation for the ethical vignette to self-disclose or not by Karli Arntz. In this presentation, I'll be applying ACA ethical standards and core professional values to a counseling case vignette. I'll use the ethical decision-making model from Forster, Miller, and Davis from 2016, and I'll walk through the dilemma step by step, consider relevant principles, and last, I will arrive at ethically sound course of action. My goal is to strengthen my professional and ethical decision-making as an emerging counselor. First, I needed to identify the problems. The main problems were self-disclosure, premature interpretation, not answering the client's question, followed by a secondary problem, the lengthy monologue. These problems relate both to my role as a counselor and to the client's experience in the session. Self-disclosure and premature interpretation are connected to my professional boundaries and to the client's autonomy because they shifted the focus toward me and framed his experience before I'd gathered enough information. This was in the first session and within the first 15 minutes. Next, not answering his question related to transparency and trust, which are essential for the therapeutic relationship. The lengthy monologue is tied to therapeutic alliance because it limited the client's voice and interrupted his ability to share his own story. The following is a list of ACA standards and state codes. You can see how they apply, like not imposing personal values, avoiding shifting focus away from client, putting the client welfare first, adequate assessment needed before forming opinions or interpretations, making sure that informed consent is present before assessment, also making sure that informed consent is clear and understandable, avoid imposing beliefs. And then I have state statutes around boundaries and competence, and making sure that I present my credentials accurately, which would not be leading with recovery. And finally, addressing appropriate assessment protocol. And then last with HIPAA, maintaining professional boundaries. In reviewing the ethical standards, each one is connected directly to the concerns that I found in the vignette. The ACA codes highlight where boundaries were blurred, where the focus shifted away from the client, and where my personal beliefs may have influenced the interaction. The assessment standards reminded me that interpretations require adequate information and informed consent. That also clients need clear explanations before I frame their experiences. Alaska regulations reinforce the importance of accurate role presentation and competence, and also appropriate assessment procedures, as well as HIPAA supporting and maintaining professional boundaries that protect the client's privacy and autonomy. Together, all of these standards help me understand exactly where the session drifted from ethical practice and will guide me toward corrective actions that keep the client's welfare at the center. The potential courses of action.
Thank you.
I would have two potential actions. First, in session, naming what happened and taking responsibility. This would have to be very brief, which would help repair the rupture and recenter David's autonomy. Then I would restate my role as a professional, invite him to share how my earlier disclosure and interpretation had impacted him. From there, I'd reinforce clear boundaries and return to client-centered exploration of his concerns. Also, outside of session, I would need to do other courses of action, which would include consulting with experienced counselors to address any blind spots that I might have, as well as reflect on my use of self-disclosure. So in the future, I don't have to make a decision in the moment, but my decisions would remain intentional and ethically grounded. Each potential action is going to carry a consequence for both the client and the counselor. So naming the mistake and taking responsibility is going to help rebuild trust. But if I over-explain or take too long to do it, it risks centering my experience again instead of David's, which would be another rupture. Restating my role and inviting his perspective supports autonomy and boundary clarity, but he might actually feel hesitant to share honest feedback, or he may not really understand his experience since he's new to counseling. Returning to clear role definition strengthens the alliance, but this sudden shift could feel corrective and bring shame or confusion around whether David did something wrong or not. Also, consulting with experienced counselors will help me address blind spots and uphold ethical standards, but also require vulnerability on my part. And then reflecting on disclosure is going to promote growth, specifically around making a different action in the future. I decided to take a combination of all of these actions because they all directly address both the immediate rupture in session, and then also the broader ethical concerns which may come into future sessions with David or other counseling sessions. So naming the mistake and restating my role is going to help repair alliance and support David's autonomy. This is going to give him space to share about how my behavior impacted him. Returning to clear role boundaries ensures that the session becomes client-centered again. This would be me making sure that he knows who the experts in the room are. I'm an expert counselor, perhaps. I might have experience and knowledge in areas that he doesn't have, but he is the expert in his own story. These align with ACA principles and respect non-maleficence. Outside of session, consulting with experienced counselors helps me reduce those blind spots and uphold ethical standards. It's going to make me a better counselor. Reflecting on my use of disclosure is going to become a long-term tool that I can use and help me grow and prevent similar boundary issues in the future. Even with these corrective actions, there may be some ethical dilemmas remaining. David may still experience a power dynamic in session, especially because my earlier monologue framed addiction in a particular way that he quickly agreed with. This might come into future sessions in where he doesn't express his thoughts or ideas because I've told him, the authority on on what addiction is. Also, my self-disclosure, even if it was used ethically, it could still create subtle pressure for him to relate to me as a peer rather than a clinician. Then, inviting him to share his experience doesn't guarantee that he'll feel safe enough to be fully honest with me. These lingering dilemmas impact both of us because they affect David's autonomy and comfort in a therapeutic relationship, and they will require ongoing self-monitoring from me and consultation to prevent bias or more boundary drifts. When I tested the justice, publicity, or universality, I was able to find a couple things. Would this actually be fair and equitable to all clients? Absolutely. Naming the mistake and restoring boundaries promotes fairness because it centers David's opinion. My earlier framing of addiction could still privilege my perspective, and that it would be an ongoing concern. I'd have to remain vigilant to make sure that I am letting David tell me his story and not the other way around, and being careful when I do include psychoeducation. Test of publicity. Would this be something I'd be comfortable if it were made public? Absolutely. Taking responsibility, clarifying roles, also consulting. They're all important actions that would be ongoing regardless of the situation. The lingering dilemma would be whether my self-disclosure was right-sized or clinically justified, especially since it was the first session. So I would definitely need to make sure that I'm explaining this without any bias and making sure that I'm not placing my needs above the client's in the future. The test of universality, would this be appropriate if every counselor acted this way? So absolutely, repairing role ruptures, clarifying roles, and consulting, these are all universally appropriate. But first session disclosure, I'm not sure that I could say that is probably appropriate for every counselor. It would definitely need to be case by case. David, in this case, asked specifically, and I think it was appropriate to respond. I also just think that I might have it just seemed like there was some over-explaining and also that lengthy monologue that got in the way of the self-disclosure being as neat and concise as it could have been. To implement my decisions, I will begin the next session by briefly acknowledging my mistake and clarifying my role as a professional counselor. This is going to help recenter David's autonomy and correct the earlier power imbalance. After inviting him to share how my disclosure impacted him, I'll give him space to voice any concerns or reactions. After that, reinforcing clear boundaries and returning focus of his goals and his lived experience. Then, again, outside of session, I'll consult with experienced counselors to ensure that I'm addressing any blind spots. And I will reflect on my own use of self-disclosure so that future decisions remain more purposeful, also ethically and clinically justified, and then aligned with current codes. And this is the slide that shows my references, including the American Counseling Association, Alaska Legislature, Forster, Melser, and David, Norcross and Lambert, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you so much.